Guys, we found another playable character. We have one. In that sea of unplayable characters, of non-playable characters, the NPCs that you hear about everywhere in the world, we found one. It's not often that we find someone of the IQ and EQ of Michelle Weekley, who we have found here today and have the pleasure of interviewing, but we found one. We found one. Michelle, in 2016, was living in Dubai. She got recruited into foreign direct investment to work as a global marketing director. In her time in foreign direct investment and economic development, it was short, but the lessons changed her life. This is why I particularly found her so fascinating and wanted her to share that journey with us. FDI is a very large part of the ecosystem that surrounds the World Economic Forum and their agenda. She was working for people who regularly attended Davos, and her background was in tech startups. She'd never heard of Davos, suddenly was surrounded by people obsessed with it. She traveled extensively to high-level conferences and meetings, spanning 20-plus countries on 4 continents, and spent a lot of time in China, and was given a literal seat at the table of the economic corruption running rampant in every corner of the globe. But, at every conference she attended, there was someone in the corner whispering about something called Bitcoin. At the same time, she was being initiated into the inner realms of global economic corruption. A small light was being shown unto the solution. She knew right then that the quiet person whispering in the corner, especially in a room full of people who want nothing but to be heard, is normally the smartest person in the room. So she started listening. In July 2017, she set up a Google alert for Bitcoin and Ethereum and read every single thing that came to her inbox. And at some point, she had to toggle the alerts from individual alerts to daily digests. I continued to receive and read those digests to this day, she says. In 2018, she left her job in the world of foreign direct investment, FDI. In 2019, moved to Florida, where she started a small consulting company, and then 2020 hit. She wasn't sure if she wanted to speak publicly about the things she had learned, and wasn't sure if anyone would even listen or believe her. Then she came back to Bitcoin. She knew Bitcoiners were seeing what she had seen. It wasn't a secret anymore. She wasn't alone. Bitcoin is that sovereign state of 150 million people, as she says, and I believe. And Bitcoin has saved her twice, first financially, then through the freedom and hope. Now, let's go. Michelle Weekley, a true playable character. Enjoy. Michelle Weekley, thank you for coming and joining me here and talking about some really cool things. What's huge with you, I think, is you've seen the belly of the beast and what's happened. So I'd love to kind of just dig into that journey and where it started and where it is now for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is in tech, and I worked for a number of years in tech startups in Washington, D.C. And then I ended up abroad. And to be honest, I just kind of got bored of living in DC. And a lot of my former colleagues were moving to San Francisco, and I just didn't want to do it. There were a number of reasons, but I just didn't want to go out there. I was like, I've never really done like what everybody else is doing. So I was like, you guys are all going out there. I'm not going out there. I've done this. And so I started traveling, and I was kind of working. I did a little bit of consulting. And so I'd do a project, and then I'd go find a country, and I started traveling. And at some point, Dubai got on my radar, and I just made it like my mission to go to Dubai just to visit. I started with the obvious places, traveling, and then I got kind of bored. And like I said, so I found Dubai. I went over there and ended up staying. I went initially for like 10 days, and I ended up staying for like 2 or 3 weeks. I was like, I'm going to live here. So I went back to the States for a little while, sorted some stuff out. You have to get all of your documents attested, which is this whole thing in order to go abroad, depending obviously on the country. So I did all the stuff I knew I'd have to do. And then I went back, and I was there on a tourist visa initially, and I would go back and forth to Oman. If anybody is familiar with visa runs, it's a thing that happens. People in the US have no idea,
No,
but anyway, so
they couldn't tell you where the Arabian Peninsula. They don't even know what the Arabian Peninsula is. Probably what we just said there. So
right. So I'll be totally honest. I didn't end up over there for any like intelligent or strategic reasons. I was just wanting to see the rest of the world. I really wanted to go to Asia. So Dubai was first on my list, and then I wanted to go to Asia. I wanted to see Thailand, and China was kind of on the list out of interest. I wanted to go to the DMZ, uh, and I figured it'd be a little easier to do from over there, which it definitely is. Like once you're over in Dubai, you start meeting all these people who are like, yeah, I spent 2 weeks in Thailand. I went here, I did this. And so I knew if I could get there that I could get to the rest of the places I was interested in going. So it was just kind of a sense of adventure that started all of it. And ended up doing a little bit of work while I was in Dubai. I worked in one of the free zones. And then ended up in Thailand and met this guy that started recruiting me to work in foreign direct investment. So that's sort of the beginning of the real story and how I ended up in like the belly of the beast, like you say. I had no idea what foreign direct investment was. My background was all tech, marketing, product development. And they didn't seem to care, which in retrospect makes a lot of sense. But at the time, I'm like hiding in a corner on my phone, Googling like economic development, foreign direct investment, like what does FDI even mean? I didn't know what a free zone was. But that world really functions around relationships, and I'm really good at relationships. In the tech space, a lot of what I did was like translating between marketing teams and dev teams and technical people, non-technical people. So I had a lot of experience translating information, from different worlds. And I think that's ultimately why I ended up getting recruited. So I went to work in foreign direct investment, didn't really know what I was getting into. And for those that don't know what foreign direct investment is, it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, basically where one country, a business or a country, invests money in another business that's in a different country. So it's just international flow of money. And about 20% of the world's e-commerce flows through what's considered FDI. And most of that is done through free zones, which is where I spent most of my time while I was working in foreign direct investment. So it's a whole thing, but ultimately the crux of it is that.
Hey, really quick, I want to annoy the hell out of you with a quick little break to just remind you that we have to share the signal within the noise because the algorithms hate truth. The algorithm hates truth. So we have to do all that we can to spread the signal. The faster we do that, the quicker change comes to the world. We need to be the change we seek to be. What are we doing? What am I doing? What are you doing to build a future? Also, if you want a written version of a lot of what we do here, please go to the description and find the link to our blog, our Substack, as well as you will see many links to either the work or the companies, the places you can find all the playable characters here that we talk to and how you can connect with them. So now back to the show. Thank you.
You're getting up really close to the power, the central banks, which I'm gonna be honest, like I had no idea what a central bank was. I knew nothing. I was so ignorant to all of these like macro level topics that we're like screaming about on Twitter every day now. So it's been a very interesting journey. And for me, that really colors the way that I look at educating people on Bitcoin, which, not to get ahead of myself, but I think back to like where I was in my career, and I thought I was like at the height of everything. I was making more money than I'd ever made in my life. I had this badass title. I had like an unchecked expense account. By all like outside measures, I was really succeeding. But it was not what it was cracked up to be. They say like don't meet your heroes, and that was kind of how it went. Like everything that was happening was just a lie, and I was traveling all around the world, and everything I saw was corrupt. People were signing multi-million deals because they were buddies or because they wanted an excuse to take somebody out for drinks. And it was crazy. And these were people whose lives revolved around attending the World Economic Forum, which, again, I'd never even heard of the World Economic Forum. I'm Googling this, like, why is everybody obsessed with this meeting? The company that I worked for hosted the World Forum for for foreign direct investment, which is like they all want to
You can't
be
keep them all straight. You
World
can't.
Economic Forum. Yeah, and if you can't
Yeah.
get an invite there, then we'll do the World Economic
Minor
Forum
leagues.
for foreign direct
Yeah.
right. So, but there were, really, really big names. Like Richard Quest was one of our MCs one year. There were a lot of really big names, and there was this brief period of time before I started questioning everything where I was just like, wow, like, okay, cool. Like, yeah, my boss is going to go to Davos and maybe I'll get invited one year. Like, but really quickly I started to see that everything was just a lie. It was kind of all made up, and it's hard to express. It's been several years now that I've been trying to figure out how to express the things that I saw. And honestly, a lot of the stuff I still second myself, like, is anybody even going to believe this? So I'm happy to see all the corruption coming out because, like you said, I was there, and the more people that are talking about it, I think the easier it is for people to believe that this really does happen. This really is how things are run.
Yeah. I don't know. Your story is so interesting, and I'm sure this is going to be something that I can already tell in a way. I mean, we're going to have to probably do more of this over time and other parts of it. But so many people like on Twitter and Bitcoiners and then you can even say people on the right and the left in the political realm in America, and then Bitcoiners who are kind of above that fray. I always joke that Bitcoiners are in a Chinese spy balloon, kind of 100,000 feet above everything, and just kind of make light of that situation. But it is true. I mean, Bitcoin really truly helps you see above all that fray and start seeing all this, and then you really. But very few, my point, Paul, is that very few people have actually been where you've been. A lot of it's still conjecture. A lot of it's like, hey, you're putting pieces together. I've done my share of reading many, many books, conspiracy theory books and all these different things where, hey, as I think it's the CIA and the FBI, I mean, they teach you don't disregard coincidence, which is a one-time event. So, conspiracy theory was made up after JFK assassination. That it wasn't in existence, and then the New York Times started using that after he was assassinated. That they were trying to label people as conspiracy theorists, this new term they came up with. And so you start to look at 1,000 different things that all kind of coalesce and like knock down these dominoes, and they're all related. And it's like, okay, there's something here, obviously, because I'm not related to 3,000 different murders. I don't have all my friends dying. Like my friends aren't going to certain islands. So like, how come I'm not implicated in these things? But these same people keep showing up and showing up, and I think that's where Bitcoiners and many people start going down the road. However, most people haven't been where you have been and seen a lot of that. So in saying that, but before we kind of go back even to your beginning, in your more of your origin story too, what does a lot of it, and again, Whitney Webb talks about this too, but again, you've kind of been in those circles. I mean, you don't have to name names, but I mean, are there people that you've seen and money, I'm sure kind of just maybe exacerbate a little bit or extrapolate on, just what you have seen, I guess, in that world of people connecting to certain people just because, and again, that FDI, the foreign direct investment, and what it's doing, the Bill Gates of the world or the George Soros or these guys that are shuffling money. I think Bill Gates owns 10% of the WHO, basically, right? And they do this to buy things off and to have influence, right? So I guess extrapolate on a little bit and kind of what you have seen at that level and where your aha was, where you're like, oh wait, like we're being played, like I'm being played here, and where that kind of aha moment came for you.
It's hard. I don't know that I had a single huge aha moment. My brain is very analytical and I tend to question things. So at some point I started questioning everything that they had me doing. One big thing was I flew from Dubai down to Colombia to present an award, and it was like an 18-hour, I don't know, a long haul flight. And I'm sitting in first class and I'm staying in nice hotels and I'm doing all of this for a photo op. And that is definitely one of the things in retrospects that like sticks out in my mind. And I'm sort of like, why are we doing this? Like, this makes no sense. In fact, I think I sent you a message. You had said something on a Spaces about the people in the photos.
That's right.
And I messaged you about this.
Yes.
Because I was one of those people in the photos, and I was a nobody, but I represented the company that I was working for, and they needed somebody there, and I was that person at that moment in time that I was traveling like 300 days a year. I was the director of marketing. So I was the right person. I had the right title. And so I've been in a couple of those pictures. And you really nailed it on the head when you were like, it's just the people in these pictures that are benefiting. And if you start looking at those pictures, you start to realize it's all the same people. So I
Over and
wasn't.
over.
Yeah, absolutely. I obviously was not like sitting down and meeting with Bill Gates or things like that, but I think the theme is the same, and that even as you go down a notch or two, it's the same stuff that's happening. And that was one of the things that was one of the aha moments. Was I would go to a conference in Shanghai, I would go to a conference in Bangkok, Doha, Qatar, and then South America. I'm in Cartagena, Colombia, and it's all the same people. You're talking the same like 100 people at most, maybe less than 100 people. And people kept introducing themselves, like they would remember me. And admittedly, I was like, I have no idea who you are, which is a little like, and so that really triggered something in me, was seeing all these same people all across the globe, at meetings where there's like, it's like these meetings have different themes, right? Different macro level themes. So I got sent to MIPIM, is like the world's largest real estate conference. And then, so you think like real estate, what does that have to do with? Well, it has a lot to do with economic development, but it didn't really matter what the theme of the conference was, and it didn't really matter where the location was. You just keep seeing the same people over and over. And that probably more than anything got me questioning everything, because, it's a huge world. There's thousands of people involved here. And it was the biggest thing that didn't make sense, was like, why are these all the same people? And a lot of it I never connected until I got out of it and sort of started to really realize what was happening. And in retrospect, I'm like, oh wow, remember that time you did this and you did this, and now it all makes sense. But yeah, so I don't know. Sorry,
No, it's yeah, absolutely. And it's just like, it just makes me think. There was just 1,000 questions running through my head. Like one of the things I always think of is, whatever party, again, here in America, being in America, we'll talk from this angle, obviously. It's just either party gets in, and I just wrote about this. I don't know if it was my blog or where I wrote about this, or on Twitter. And it was like, at one point, I think it's fascinating of when people wake up. I was talking to Eric Cason. I'm going to interview him in a couple weeks, maybe in Miami, actually. But like I come from a very like libertarian, like constitutional point of view, and just that was my entire life. That was my frame. So I tended to be a conservative by nature and Republican by nature. And over the last 10 years, 12 years, I realized, oh wow, it's not red versus blue, it's the state versus you, right? Like it just became very obvious after TARP bailouts in 08, because it was like, oh hey, the Republicans, the guys that were like for fiscal responsibility, were the ones that were starting it. Obama comes and finishes it off. I'm like, whoa, these guys are on the same team, like Hank Paulson, all these guys, guys that are flying to events that you're at, like the bankers and all these people. And you realize, whoa. But like Eric Cason, he grew up very different. And I know like the Bledge, who's does Toxic Happy Hour, is on a lot of the spaces we're in. Same thing. He grew up like Occupy Wall Street movement, like very like 180 degrees. I've had some talks with these guys, and I'm going to interview them too, because I think it's fascinating. Like, how did you come to this aha moment of like realizing, like, as I came to the same thing, but from like the other side of the spectrum, like where that's fascinating to me, of like, and you too, there's a lot of people that go about this as non-playable characters. And I always joke, like when we're in this, I say, hey, we found a playable character, because I think non-playable characters and NPCs are just like life, and they try to just drone everybody and just like distract everyone what's going on. And like the people that are in it, I mean, there's thousands of people that you're working with, but you woke up, like, so I think that's so fascinating. The psychology behind things is the most like interesting thing to me with all this, of how people wake up and why they wake up and realize I'm being played. Because for me, it was graduating college in 09, seeing this firsthand, just being like, whoa, I'm being played, and I got to figure this game out. And so just that's where it started for me. not to go down my rabbit hole, but that it makes me think of 1,000 different things because of that. So you just seeing that firsthand, I think you're one of the more interesting people on Twitter because of that perspective. And in saying that, I got to hear, by the way, really quick side tangent. How did the Mark Moss interview come? How did that come about? We got to talk about that quick. So how did this come about?
Okay.
Because really quick though, to set this up. So I remember finding you on Twitter, and you had like 200 or 300 followers, and you had just got on Twitter. Like you weren't allowed on Twitter. I'm just giving people the long story short. Like you really weren't on Twitter, kind of like I was. I was never on Twitter until like 6-8 months ago. And then you were not on Twitter at all. You had a couple hundred followers, and then you started, like, I saw you really early on. I saw your story, and I'm like, man, this is like, you're like one of the coolest stories I've seen on Bitcoin Twitter. And there's a lot of cool people out there, but I was like, your story has to be told more. So I messaged you like, hey, you got to come on. This is a couple months ago, and there's been a lot going on. I've got 4 little kids running around, and there's all kinds of stuff. You're busy, etc. And then you're on Mark Moss in the meantime. I'm like, yeah, let's go. Like people are starting to see what I saw here. Like, I'm like, let's go. So how did this all come about? You gotta talk about this quick.
Okay, so in retrospect, I don't know that like Mark Moss was the very first venue or podcast. For those who have not had Mark Moss like rapid fire questions at them, I was sort of like a deer in headlights. And so I'm hoping that over time I can redeem that. But yeah, I was not on Twitter at all. And until after the Elon Musk acquisition, I was like, all right, well, let's try it out. Let's see what's happening. And the more that I started getting involved in Bitcoin Twitter, the more that I realized, okay, these people get it. These people have seen a lot of what I've seen. They get it.
Yes. And really quick, by the way, again, to give people context, you went from literally not being on Twitter, basically like 100, 200 followers. I saw you at that point, and you're what, like 2,000 followers now? Or this is just a couple of months. So, I mean, like your story is awesome, and people are resonating with that. So I guess that was kind of the context as well. So sorry, go ahead.
Well, I appreciate that. I have done a lot of work in marketing, so I'm still working on figuring out the Twitter algorithm. And so that, that's what I was doing. I get on Twitter. I'm like, how does this even work? Like, I don't know. Twitter is sort of an all or nothing situation, right? Like there's a lot of people that are on Twitter passively and they're just reading. And that's what I was doing up until, like you said, a couple of months ago. I had an anonymous account. I would log into mine every once in a while, and I was really just following. And I was very nervous I had some marketing clients, and I was really nervous about what they would think about my real opinions on things. And at some point, I just got over it, right? Some things in my life changed. So I started tweeting, and I'm not going to lie. I was like playing around with the algorithms and trying to figure out like, how does Twitter even work? Like what garners engagement and what doesn't. And I think I had put a couple tweets out that like hit in engagement. And I remember Mark Moss commented on one of them, and it was something about living abroad and working in China. I spent a lot of time in China, which again, really colors like everything that we're seeing now. In retrospect, it's like I was there and I was seeing it. So anyway, Mark Moss had commented, and I'll never forget because I was like really excited. I was like, oh, hey, Mom, Mark Moss commented on my tweet. And she's like, I don't know what that means. Leave me alone. But then a couple days later, his producer DM'd me and reached out and was just like, we've been talking a lot about what's going on in the global markets, and there's not a lot of people, like you said, who have been over there, let alone I spent a lot of time there, and I worked there, which is a whole different experience. Setting foot in a lot of these places is a story into itself, but working there is a whole nother story. And so I guess I hit their radar. Mark Moss talks a lot about obviously geopolitics, the de-dollarization and all of that. And I had thought, so for people listening, I made Brandon send me some questions, just because I'm like, okay. So I thought that was going to be like a more long form conversational interview with Mark. And I also was told that it was not live. And so it turns out that it was live. So I come in.
Boy.
And they're like on air, they did like a really quick sound check, and there was no intro, there was no hi, there was nothing. And so I like totally froze
Like you're a
up.
correspondent from the Middle East or something. It was just like,
Yeah,
here we
yeah.
go,
And
live from
to
Jerusalem.
be fair, like perhaps I was presenting that way on Twitter, and I think I do a lot better like in writing. My brain works really slowly. Like I really tortured myself for days after the Mark Moss thing because I had great responses to all of his questions, but it takes my brain a minute to like process things and figure out how I want to answer. And so he would ask me a question and my brain would start to think, and I'm trying, I said like, yeah, a lot. Like I look like the opposite of somebody that, I've had media training, which all went out the window. But because of his style and because of this like compressed time frame, as my brain was processing, I think he was like, I'm just going to move on. So he would go to the next question and my brain was still trying to keep up or process the previous question. So again, like I said, Mark, maybe you can let me redeem myself one day. I am well versed at writing and putting things out in written form because I can take as much time as I want, but I'm practicing these sort of things, which, that was the very first interview or podcast that I did, and it was pretty intense, and I just froze up. So.
And that's it's just funny too, because that's his personality. Like he goes. He just like, again, I was watching his Whitney Webb interview the other day. He did, and he's just like she's like half in a sentence, and he's already like going next question. It's like, let her finish, Mark. Like I need to know what she's saying here. So it's just, hey, everyone's got their different strokes though. But again, to your point, you are a great writer, and it shows on Twitter, and that's why the algo or whatever picked it up. And like I said, I wasn't one of the first people or the first person, but like very early on, right when you got on Twitter, got back, like you were right in my feed, like you had shared your story, and it was, it clearly the algorithm knew that I liked stuff like that and got stuff like that. Cause like, again, just like the perspective, people seeing things from a different angle, the psychology of things is what I tend to click on or be interested in, because I've laughed for a long time that I want to name a podcast or, this show or something like Band-Aids on bullet holes. And I just don't know if I can name something that in this day and age, unfortunately. Maybe I should, because
do it. Forget it.
I should. I'm obsessed with getting to the core, like deep root issue. And so much of politics is like just surface area and just the symptoms. We deal with like these symptoms and down the river effects with everything. That's all society. And it's the most frustrating thing you've ever seen, which comes back to Bitcoin, which is fix the money, fix the world. And we're just constantly, America loves, the Western culture, like let's pop some pills, 6-minute abs, like it's just no work involved, none. And it's just like, guys, this is never going to fix. We're trying to fix cultural problems. Yeah. Our families are broken. You're just doing all the things backwards. And it just, so anyway, but
I have to say, as a marketing person, I vote hardcore on that name. Cause controversy, do it. It's better to have people love you and hate you than to do something that nobody's ever going to remember.
See that I'm not worried about that necessarily. It's more of just like the algorithm and just being shadow banned, like straight up, just like, oh, this guy's got bullets in this thing. Like, yeah, you're gone. So it's
a risk.
It is, for sure.
You can always rename it. So try it.
Yeah, true. I know right now I've just been toying around with like non-playable characters, NPC or NPC Ultra, a little play on MK Ultra, but
I like that.
Yeah. So, it's one of those things where Band-Aids and bullet holes is people get it though more, where, MK Ultra, a lot of people don't understand, what's going on. Yeah. So, anyway, enough about that for now. Let's get back to you. Let's go back, even growing up, because we do, so I work with Bitcoin trading cards, and help do marketing stuff with them. And we're starting to do a lot of this more now. And we're starting to be asked to be on stuff. Aladdin, who is the artist and the founder of it. And I've for 12 years been on the mission of, hey, how can we educate kids? I have a bunch of kids books that I've written, ABCs of Bitcoin. They're going to be coming out this year. And actually next week, I'll see you next week. Even I'll have you just, check some of the things out and just the written part, but I'm waiting to get the art done with the team and Aladdin and stuff like that. So, in saying all that, I always think it's interesting because again, we can talk macro all day, and there's plenty of people that do that, right? The Mark Mosses, the Fosses, the Lepards, there's all kinds of guys that we all love that talk about it all day long. But to me, like the youth is the big thing, and in having 4 little kids of my own, And I always joke as well. There's a guy in the 30s in Germany that knew if you control the youth, you control the future. And that's something that globalists understand very well. They teach their kids, like this is the Rothschilds, what you go back to trilateral commissions, the Rockefellers, all this stuff. It's constantly teaching your children, hey, this is how we keep the dynasty intact. This is how we're going to create a moat around everything and not let anyone in. So to that end, I think it's important for freedom-minded people and to have that and start building that in on their own and start to, just not attack it, but just kind of come back against the globalists, these one world government people, for lack of a better phrase. So what was your introduction just to money as a kid growing up, and kind of what was that story that led you down the road, the path of just being a child and then growing into money and then, finding Bitcoin really? And what was that story for you like?
Yeah. I agree with you completely. Yuri Bezmenov, by the way, is another one. I assume you've seen his interview. But we definitely need to do something about the children. I don't want to say indoctrinate them on our side, are being indoctrinated. And so if we don't educate them and push back on all of that, then you're just going to continue to see what's happening. I grew up in the Midwest when I was younger, with a relatively conservative family. And, to be honest, we were taught not to talk about money. We moved to Philadelphia when I was in middle school. And then so I went to boarding school, which a lot of people make a lot of assumptions once they hear that. And that, I think, really colored a lot of the ways that I thought about things, some good ways and some not good ways. But in boarding school, again, you don't talk about money. And I think there was kind of a disservice in that. And in retrospect, it's probably by design that they don't want you understanding the system. I believe, I don't know that anyone, especially in this world, disputes that this is all by design and that the ignorance is by design. And I was pretty ignorant. My family, we were relatively middle class, and sort of moved up as my dad moved up in his career. As I got older, I have two younger brothers, and they, grew up a little bit differently than I did. But when I was a kid, I used to ask my parents for things like everybody does. And my dad would make me go wash windows, and I would get, like 5 cents or a quarter or something. I think I got a quarter for like washing his car. And so there was a little bit of structure around money and it was really hard work, I think, more than it was money. And I got that worked. So I have always worked really hard. I'm not afraid of working. I spent many years working just like around the clock. But I think, so the hard work values got instilled, but I don't know that there were really values around money. Money was really more like this thing that we don't talk about. And I don't know if that was because my parents were conservative or necessarily where that came from. But now when I look at the world, I think that it's intentional and by design. And so it's important to talk to kids about money. And it's hard to figure out, where do you draw those lines? You don't want to come in at the kids like, oh, central banking and all of these things. So I think it's really important. What you're doing is sort of like boiling it down to what are the important things and what is sort of age appropriate to learn at what stage. And Bitcoin being hard money and having it backed by something is probably a good significant piece of that. I don't have any kids, but if I had kids, I feel like that's probably where I would start.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. I mean, I know one of the questions that I sent you was just, what's one of the more important parts or what are the most important things for kids to learn? And I think that's it. Like my kids are 6, 4, 2 and newborn basically. And our 6 and 4-year-old know the difference. Or two of our girls, they know the difference. Like we'll be at mass on Sunday or whatever. And like you give dollars into the basket or whatever. And she's like, those are fake dollars. And so it's just understanding. And then she asked why, like, well, why do they trick you? Like, why does the government try to trick you? And it's just like opening up that conversation of what it is. And like you said, it's by design, clearly. I mean, like the messing with the money is by design, the psyops, everything, the way they were teaching you, the Rockefellers, the General Education Board in 1902, everything was for a reason. He wanted doers, not thinkers. I mean, they said it, they literally have said it. And they've, it's funny because everyone like fights you on it. And still to this day, I have many friends and family, they still fight me on it. Like they get it intellectually and they're like, hey, Brandon, like they trust me because I'm a friend or a family member. And they're like, hey, he's smart. He's seemingly been smart his whole life and seems to do well for himself. So it's like, okay, like I get it. Like I'm not going to fight you on it, Brandon, but like they don't totally get it, right? They're not like, okay, like it's just like if you only knew and only saw like that money it has to be a store of value and they've taken that from you and when you do that, just obviously dominoes, like we talked about these second, third order effects, and down the river here, we're dealing with all these issues and then everyone loves to fight, right? All these same people love to fight about these second, third, 10th, 20th order effects instead of just fixing the one thing, the band-aid on the bullet hole. They're just constantly, and everyone does it. And we've all kind of been that thing. Like I said, I was very political based when I was like in middle school, high school, college, fighting with professors, fighting with teachers, being, in political science in college and stuff. And then realizing, oh, like I'm the idiot, like I was ignorant. I didn't realize that I'm fighting an unwinnable fight. So coming back full circle, I mean, I think that is, like you said, it's the most important thing for kids to learn of, hey, money has to be something valuable and it has to be, not a claim check, not an IOU. And I just think that's so huge. And starting there with the building blocks, and then they can get some central banking in a few years, right?
Right.
So what do you, I mean, just as a society, like, what do you think that we're missing from society? And also what are maybe some other like important first principles, or like, I mean, how do you see the world? Again, coming back to like, how do we, how you saw things, kind of the scales falling from your eyes when you were working overseas and seeing what's happening. What are things do you think that like aren't taught in school or should be taught in school, whether it's like psychological deception going on, or like even just tools we can use as people? And what are some things that have helped you to kind of see through things and just questioning things rather than just being a non-playable character and just kind of like going along? It's like, oh yeah, okay, here's my fantasy sports and here's my football game and I'm good to go. Don't need to ask questions.
So the school that I went to actually most was founded on the Socratic method. So most of my classes were like, we just sat around and questioned everything. And I'm really, really grateful for that. I think that has been like the most important thing in my life. So that's really important to me. And that's sort of how I look at everything. And I've always questioned everything, but this is an interesting like topic and question for me, because just because you're questioning everything, it doesn't mean that you're always questioning the right things. So you had mentioned, Occupy Wall Street, and I was living in DC during Occupy in 2008. And I was working at Living Social. If anybody has ever heard of them, they were like we were trying to compete with Groupon. We were second to market, and they ultimately got acquired by Groupon, but we had a ton of money, and it was a crazy early days startup. And I was living in that life during Occupy. And there was this period of time we had just moved offices. We were right downtown DC. And when I walked to my car at the end of the day, I had to walk past the park in DC where Occupy was set up. And I was not into it. I was like, go home. Like, it's, I don't know what you're trying to do, which I didn't. I don't think this is the right way to go about it. And now in retrospect, I was like, wow, I was on the wrong side of that. I don't think at the time that I realized the level that all went to, and that it was, I think most of those people that were heavily involved in that had already seen that this is an us versus them, like people versus the state sort of thing. And I've always been very libertarian. I used to go to like the Tea Party stuff that they did in DC.
Yep.
And so even being, from that mindset and thinking,
which is a very similar mindset actually, but they told you that you're very different, which is
yes, again, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I try to like be really patient with people, because I think of myself as somebody who questions everything. But I think back to Occupy Wall Street, and I was young then. I mean, I graduated, in '08, and I was working, and you care about other things, right? Like, you have a social
Right.
life, and so a lot of this stuff doesn't start to matter until you start to get older and you see
Yep.
more things. But I do try to think about that and have patience with people, because I'm like, nobody really, like, most people don't really question things the way that I do. And, like, look at what I missed.
Yes.
So that is, kind of where I'm coming from with a lot of that.
Yeah, that it's super interesting you say that, and that's something that I've just realized, just turning 36 a couple weeks ago. And I grew up playing hockey my entire life, and seeing and being in fights all the time, stuff like that. And like, it's just funny because, like, you as a human being, we always think like, how does this person not see that? But like,
Right.
like, it takes you a while to understand, like, oh, no one grew up the way you did. Like, every single
Right.
person's life is completely different. Like, even like my brother, 9 years younger, like, he had a completely different life, even though he played hockey too. Like, everything, his life was very different. Like, he was the youngest, I was the oldest. He was playing hockey at a different time, in a different position. I was a defenseman, he's a forward. Like, very different lives. Like, he was more of a skilled player, I was more of a physical player. So like, I just look at life of like, yeah, like, you're gonna get your butt beat if you do stupid things. Like, I'm gonna do it to you, or I'm gonna get it done to me. Like, if I'm gonna dish it out, I better be able to take it. And we're like, we talk about snowflake culture. Like, to me, that doesn't make any sense. I'm like, didn't people grow up like getting beat up, or like beating each other up, or like, wrestling? Like, we get in a fight and like figure it out. Like, I would go to hockey practice, and like, we get in a fight, and then like, I'd be asking my parents like, hey, can Sean come over later? Like, you just guys got in a fight and during practice. And like, that's boys, number one. But that's been like relegated out of society. They don't even let people fight in hockey anymore half the time. I mean, you watch NHL nowadays here and there. It's just crazy like how things have changed. But to your point, it's, you don't even realize that people haven't grown up like you. Like, they didn't have your parenting. They didn't go to boarding school, or they didn't go to private school. They didn't go to the school you went to, or so they don't have that ability to just see through psychological deception the way you might, or the way I might, or the way this other person might. And I think that's fascinating. I look at like the political spectrum as like a circle. Like, ironically, to me, like, the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street are a lot closer. Like, to me, they're almost back around the same loop, where like, they're actually really close, and people think they're like on two opposite ends of the spectrum. Where like, the Tea Party, and again, like, I thought that as a kid when I was younger, where now I realize like, it's more of a circle. And like,
Yeah.
those people are actually very close. Like, one group is saying, hey, don't tell me what to do with my healthcare, like, get out of the
Right.
healthcare, don't socialize my country. And Occupy Wall Street was saying, hey, bankers, get out of my pocketbook, like, stop screwing the money, and stop, like, they were saying the same thing. And
Yeah.
we just didn't realize, like, I didn't realize it, and no one did, because the media is telling us, and the government's telling us, like, oh, these
Yeah.
people are losers over here, and those people are losers. So it's just fascinating. I think this is the most interesting talk to have for everybody, because everyone can have this talk. Like, Bitcoin to me is like, not everyone can have that talk of like the central banking, or the finance part of it, and the macro. Like, that's just kind of above everyone's head a lot of time. And that's where here I love what we're talking about, and trying to talk about these things with that the average person, hopefully the average pleb, like any of us, because we're all plebs at the end of the day, can understand. So and anything you can touch on there. But at the same time, I mean, what do you like, what do you think is the living your life? Do you think that, speaking of Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party, do you think it is a way, because I've got my own thoughts and opinions that have changed a lot over the last few years, especially since 2020, but do you think that freedom comes from the government, or is it a way you live your life? Like, where are you on that spectrum, speaking of spectrums?
So I thought about this a lot, because I lived in these countries where obviously the government, you don't have freedom the way that you do in the States, really authoritarian countries. And in some ways, this is something I'm still sort of struggling with, because in a lot of ways I look back at living in Dubai and I'm like, it was really nice there. Like, my life was great. Um, and people ask me like, are you going to go back? And it's tempting. Um, to answer your question, I don't think that freedom comes from the government, but I think there has to be I don't want to say that like the government has to allow freedom. But it kind of does, right? Because if they're limiting freedoms and that begins to escalate, which we've seen happen rapidly since 2020, then you're not free. You know, I think people have to
I'm glad you
want
brought this up.
freedom. That, you know, it's obviously freedom is a very individual thing, and I think it comes from both in a sense, but it can be limited by the government, which we've seen just happening at this rapid rate in 2020. And I think in light of all of that, now people are understanding. I mean, personally, I think, you know, there's a lot of things that were an illusion before 2020. And that we thought that we had a lot of freedoms that we
Like
didn't
freedom.
necessarily have.
Right. In general.
So, you know, I guess it's a complex question. I don't want to say that I believe freedom comes from the government, but it can be limited by the government.
Yes.
And so if it's really heavily limited, you know, then
yeah. And so a little bit of context for this too. So like the last few years, obviously, like it's one of those things where I just honestly didn't think about it that much. Like, in a way, I probably thought more or less like, hey, the government, gives you freedom in a way. I just didn't think about it really enough because, like, again, we were very grateful that we lived in America where you didn't have to, right? Like, at least we didn't think we had to. And you kind of just lived your life, and the government wasn't tracking you down, and lowest learner at the IRS wasn't, coming after you. Conservative groups or people with freedom in their name or bullets in their name or whatever it is. But you really realize, oh wow, like. And I was a person that carried the Constitution with me. I had for years, and as a kid, like I had it on me, the Constitution and everything, and not even understanding truly what it meant, that all the rights are inherent, like they come from God. Or if someone's going to argue with me about there being a God or not, they come from above. They don't come from man. And that right there is the big difference for me, where the rights come from someone else other than man, other than government. That's it. Government is there to work at the consent of the people and to protect those rights. That is it. So to me, government doesn't give you the rights, but I like what you said there, because government can, because it leads me to something else here, which is government can take those rights away if you're not careful. But I still believe you can live as a free person, and no matter what regime you're in. There obviously, like the Viktor Frankl, the Man's Search for Meaning, like you have your thoughts in your head, and like even in a concentration camp, he was like, hey, I'm still a free person. I still can think whatever I want, right? So there's that realm of it. However, I think this is the point I'm getting at, is I think libertarians, and this is what 20 years ago I remember this being a problem. It's been a problem for a long time, and Bitcoiners now fall into this trap, which is all politics is local, and we have abdicated a lot of that responsibility. Libertarians have, Bitcoiners do now to a degree, thinking, hey, Bitcoin's inevitable, which it is. However, there's still gonna be a lot of collateral damage if you don't get involved, if you don't go to a meeting a year, or go to your PTA, or go to a mayoral meeting, or see who are your politicians locally and figure out what's going on. Because it's the old founding fathers quote, I think it's Ben Franklin, saying that if you aren't involved in politics, you'll be governed by your inferiors. So government can easily make your life a living hell. And that's basically what has been done, meaning it's stripped your liberties, freedoms. You're getting anal cavity search at TSA. Like, that's all, like, everyone deals with that. So no one can sit here and say, like, well, I live as a free person, Brandon. Well, do you? Do you not fly anywhere? Do you live on a ridge somewhere like Ruby Ridge in 1992? Could you live completely off the grid, everything? Because maybe that person can, but everyone else, you are not a free person, quite honestly. So that, to me, I think it's a really good point to bring up, and kind of the nuance of what you said there, because Bitcoiners, libertarians, all, like, a lot of them, I knew libertarians back in the day that were like, I'm not voting, I'm not even part of the system. Well, it's like, well, okay, well, you're going to be screwed by the system then, because now you are the problem. You are being that problem now. So anyway, that's I wanted to get to ESG for a second, side tangent, but anything you can mention, you can talk about anything there, because I was going off on a tangent, but I think it's a really, like, nuanced, like, point that has to be again, we could talk about an hour just that alone, I think. Absolutely. But anyway,
it's interesting what you say, because that time frame that I referenced, like being in DC and the Tea Party, and that was totally my attitude. Like, I didn't vote. I'm like, I don't care. I don't want to be involved in politics. You can do whatever you want. Like, let me do whatever I want. But my opinion on that has really evolved as the world has changed and I've grown up. And now I really agree with you that things on a hyper local level really matter. And we talk about like at the macro level, everything like falling apart, and people get mad because they're like, it's going to be a disaster if everything falls apart and we're in a deep recession and all of these things. But I think the silver lining that would come out of all of that is it's going to force everyone to develop like hyper local communities. And I think that is one of the only ways to save what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
Save our freedom.
Yeah, and that's where Bitcoiners, like I said, libertarians and Bitcoiners have been wrong on this in a way, but they also have the answer, which is Bitcoin and being local, which is like decentralization. If you have states' rights, or just like you are involved in your municipality, and everyone is, then nothing else matters. Like if everyone is involved in their like local politics, their township even, or whatever, it's bottom up, and you wouldn't even deal with. No one would even care. No one even know who the president is, because it wouldn't matter at that point. But we've the one world government or whatever, they've made everything so like federal and just like taken all the power. And again, it's our problem too. We've allowed this to happen. We've abdicated responsibility. We don't know, who's being elected in our township, in our city. So it's like, we're the problem. We are all the problem. We sit here like one guy's going to change it, like Joe Biden, Donald Trump, or these guys can't do anything. Like they're not even the ones that pull the strings at the end of the day. Yeah. So I think it's so true. And that decentralization is massive, and having that decentralization and then the states' rights. And that's what made America great as well, this decentralization, which is Bitcoiners with the answer of, hey, we have to decentralize these things. So understanding that's politics, and you have to look at it that way as well. And then it does limit government. So you don't have to deal with government in a way, right? If you just do your duty, you don't actually have to have government in your life messing with you. So anyway, that could be a whole nother segment. So let's still have 10,000 thoughts on that. But okay, tangent really quick on ESG. I had a note here, and I don't have your whole tweet, but I know you were talking about ESG just being a scam, this goes back to the Club of Rome 50, 60 years ago, creating climate change as this thing to get the government or the world into a big enough problem so that way they could psyop people into like, hey, it's global cooling, then it was global warming, now it's climate change. I was going to say, don't forget,
it wasn't climate. It wasn't climate change, it was global warming, and that never happened. So now it's climate change.
Always every 10, 15 years it changes, right? I mean, cooling, warming, climate change. Now we see energy usage, right? In a way, like it's Bitcoin's being attacked with energy usage, right? It's like too much energy and this and that. So anyway, touch on anywhere in that realm of just any of your experience with ESG, and just you can kind of go anywhere with that. But I think this is a really fascinating thing that's really beginning to crumble before everyone's eyes over the last year or two.
Oh, it's a big question. I remember. So at some point I read something, and this was many, many years ago, before ESG was really even a thing. But when they started, you started to see like the plastic straws being banned and plastic bags. They were going to charge, you can't use them, or they're going to charge for them or something. And so I get like fixated on stuff, and I research and I dig. And I remember looking at and finding out that it's something like 80 to 80, it might even be like 88 or 90% of all pollution in the world comes from like 3 different countries, and it's all comes from corporations, right? Like these mega industrial corporations. A lot of them are in China and in India, where there's all this manufacturing happening. And I found something also about how there was this intentional design of blaming the consumer for the recycle campaign and all of that. And I don't always have you asked before about like aha moments, and I am sort of generally slow to come to conclusions, but I think with ESG I did have an aha moment, and it was like 80% of the pollution is coming from 3 places. So don't tell me that my plastic straw matters, and there, okay, you can talk about the animals and the sea turtles and all of that, but it's really just a psyop to make you care because they're cute, right? And nobody wants them to eat a plastic. But there's other ways to deal with that responsibly, and it's, the story is overblown. So my thoughts on that have always been really strong, and I think they're colored from that early research that I did. Interestingly enough, I was trying to go at somebody on Twitter just like the other day, And I Googled it because I used to Google this a lot to bring up that exact statistic that I found many years ago, and you can't find it anymore.
Wow.
In fact, I have gotten really good at like really hyper tailoring my Google to find the information that I'm looking for, because it's getting harder and harder.
Yeah.
And so I spent like 45 minutes the other day aggressively looking for this specific research study, and I can't find it. It's gone. So
Jeez.
I've got like on a list somewhere to go through. I think I emailed a link to it to somebody many years ago. And so I'm going to go back and try and find it, but even that alone blows my mind. Like now when you Google, I screenshotted the results that I was getting because they weren't even neutral, right? They were like aggressively talking about consumer responsibility for pollution. Oh, you know what it was? Fossil fuels also. Like they want to get rid of fossil fuels, but if you just turned off fossil fuels, there's a specific number somebody did somebody researched that within 72 hours, like X number of people would be dead because they rely on fossil fuels to stay alive in really important.
You're touching on something here.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And
Can you repeat
can't
that?
find that study anymore either. Again, I was like trying to tailor. I'm looking for a specific study that I read several years ago, trying to get facts and references, and you can't even find it anymore. It all says, fossil fuels kill. I think it was that like 8 million, it might have been 8 billion, I don't know, people would die within 3 days if you turned off fossil fuels. But I can't find the number. If anybody knows what that number is, or has access to the study, send it to me. But now the first like 3 full pages of Google results are how many people die because of fossil fuels.
It's incredible.
So,
have you read like the Conspirators Hierarchy, the Committee of 300, or like Tragedy and Hope, or I'm trying to think of some other ones. I mean, because that's
I'm going to.
Oh my goodness.
I'm going to write these down.
Yeah, I've got a handful. I've got a half dozen of them. If you want,
send me a list. I'll read them.
I will. I'll put in the description too a bunch of these books, but it's boy, oh boy, and just talks about all this stuff. Really, I mean, it goes through like Conspirators Hierarchy goes through. It was Dr. John Coleman. He was, I believe, a former British. I think he was MI6. He was a British intelligence official in like the mid 20th century, and then he started kind of like compiling all this stuff, kind of like very similar to you in a way, where he was in different fields nonetheless, but doing similar things, right? Like looking at all this stuff overseas, obviously talking to a lot of people, and then was on these projects where he was like coming across some weird documents, some weird things, and then basically spent like decades putting this all together, and then they wrote this book in I think it came out in the early 80s, early 90s, the Conspirators Hierarchy, but he had been putting it together for decades, and it just like wrote the tree out of everything, like the Committee of 300, and then all the branches of everything, like NATO, everything, and how all of it's linked, like the World Economic Forum, Club of Rome, all this stuff. And it's just wild. And, long story short, he basically is just like, and people ask me why these people want to control the world. He said, well, these people have been ruling the world for a long time, the Rothschilds, people like that, and they'd want to keep their dynasty, and they inherently think they're gods. Like they think they're like, hey, we deserve this, and the world is going to end. So the useless eaters need to be called, and that's just, probably 4 or 5 billion people need to be exterminated, basically, because they're destroying the planet. And it's a long story short, right? So it's, how do you get to this? How do you do all that, right? Well, let's create all these NGOs, all these organizations, all this FDI, all this stuff, right? We're going to keep doing all this and keep squeezing everyone, break the money. And it's the Rothschild quote, right? I don't care who does the laws, as long as I control the money, I control the world. And so it's the band-aids and bullet holes. We argue endlessly about all this garbage that doesn't matter. And if you just fix the money, like you wouldn't have to spend any time arguing on any of this stuff. That's what's wild to me. So anyway,
that's why they're going to fight it. That's why they're fighting it so hard. And it's, I think it's only going to accelerate. So,
and that's like, I love Ron Paul, but it's like, we're going to audit the Fed. We're going to do these stuff, years ago. And it's like, well, that's great. But it's like, again, that just get rid of it, like get rid of the Fed, fix the money. Like, like, we don't even need to get rid of the Fed. Just like, it'll just go away if you go above them, so, easier said than done, obviously, right? But in saying all that, like Ron Paul and all these people, what did you? I know we've been going for dang near an hour, so we'll end up doing more of this. I know, and have some other parts to this for sure. But what did you study to become? Michelle, like who you are today, and what are you reading now, and what are you looking at each day? Like how did you kind of get to where you are, and some of the things you were studying and some of your mentors, and then when you're getting up every day, like what's kind of your routine? What are you looking at each day? Because I know that's what I get very curious about, like what everyone does every day. I ask everyone, like, what are you reading? Who do you like? Who are your mentors? I think it's fascinating. Again, this is the psychology of all that. So
yeah. Before I answer that, do you know what the Smith-Mund Act is? The Smith-Mund Act.
No, I don't think I do.
Okay. So in 1948, the Smith-Mund Act explicitly forbid information and psychological operations aimed at influencing the U.S. public opinion. And in 2013, the Obama administration nullified the Smith-Mund Act, which basically means that they are running psyops on us, and they have been for a long time. So check that out, and we can talk about that more further, but I wanted to make sure that I brought that up. But so what did I study, and what do I look at every day? So I initially studied computer science. I was a huge nerd growing up. Everybody in my family is an engineer. My mom is a software engineer. And so we had a computer really early, before there were operating systems. And I was a big computer nerd. I grew up a wannabe hacker and hanging out in all these online communities and stuff like that before, I don't want to say before it was cool, but I was kind of nobody thought it was cool when I was a kid. Trust me, they were all like, "You're weird," and I got away with a little bit of it because I was little and cute and blonde, but most of the people just thought I was weird. So computer science, and I initially went to college for computer science, but it just ended up being too much. I was in a 5-year program. There were only 11 girls.
Wow.
And I was in upstate New York, and it snowed in October, and it was still snowing in May, and I just couldn't do it. I was a little more social than that. And so I left. So I'm a computer science dropout. I ultimately ended up with a marketing degree. I've always been really interested in psychology and sociology. But my parents actually fought me really hard. I wanted to get a degree in psychology. And my dad was basically like, what are you going to do with that? You could be a therapist, but that's your only career path. And it doesn't seem very useful. So I was like, well, what's the next closest thing, that touches on business? And so I got a business degree, or not a business degree, but a marketing degree from a business school. And that took me several years. I dropped out of school several times. I was never really into school. I was working at the time, and I was like, I'm learning, I have a real job. Why do I need to go to classes?
Who would have thought? Yeah.
So I ended up going to 3 different schools and hacking credits together. And I got credits I had a full-time job. I got credits for that. So I kind of got my degree at my parents' insistence. And then ultimately kind of ended up back in tech despite my marketing degree, just because it's what I was good at and that's where the jobs were. So I worked for an ISP, and then I went and worked for Living Social, and again, sort of came up that way like we talked about in the beginning. So here we are now. And I will also say I'm kind of always studying everything. I have a little bit of that autistic focus where I get hyper focused on things and I get really deep into researching them. So I read a lot right now. I'm normally reading 2 books. So right now I'm reading The Creature from Jekyll Island, which I had never read, and that's insane. But also,
okay, really quick, by the way, how this is how we know it's an agenda. Going back to what we said earlier, how is that not required reading for every student, right? I mean,
absolutely.
Very simple questions, then you know the answer, right? So anyway. Keep
Yeah,
going.
absolutely. And I don't think I'd even ever heard of it. I kept hearing about it. A bunch of people have been talking about it on Twitter. And I was like, I don't think I've even ever heard of this book. And here are all these people, you know. So I'm like, well, I have to read this book. But yeah, excellent point, and totally, to me, just like proves everything. But it's dense and hard to get through. So I'm generally reading like one nonfiction book and one fiction book. So Creature from Jekyll Island is my nonfiction book. And then I'm reading Ben Mesrick's newest book, which I guess he's a little bit of a blend. He kind of writes stories, but I read a lot. I blow through fiction books just to kind of quiet my brain and shut it off. But I think it helps me think
That's
and
awesome.
process information as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually in Bitcoin Trading Cards, actually the first series that came out end of last year, and then series 2 actually is coming out in Miami next week. We have Creature from Jekyll Island was in the first series actually of cards. So
That's awesome.
yeah, it's a classic. I mean, it's something that everyone should read. It just, you know, it's very obvious when you start peeling back the layers of what's happening with money, etc. But also, like, why are we not taught these things? Obviously, it's very, very clear when you start like actually thinking and removing yourself and putting yourself above the fray. So mentors, who are some people that you look up to? It could be in Bitcoin world, Bitcoin Twitter, could be anywhere. People that you worked with, people that you did see around the world. I mean, who are these some people that you've kind of looked up to or did and then do now as well?
Yeah. So to be honest, I never really had, I kind of always like forged my own path and was like fighting against authority. I never had like traditional mentors. And I hadn't thought about this really until you asked me this. So I'm going to recommend that everyone does find a mentor, because I think it's one thing that maybe I didn't get right. And of course, there's lots of life left to live. But I was kind of doing counterculture things. Just like I said, I was into computer science and all of that. And so I had some anonymous mentors, like when I was coding and in that world. And then I got into tech, and I don't know that there was ever like really just specific mentors. But there's a lot of people that I look up to, and I think I really, really like, especially on Bitcoin Twitter, I do like the boomer guys like Greg Foss, Leopard, Bob Burnett. I think, they obviously are looking back at
Perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, they've got a lot more perspective.
Yep.
And I think they have a lot of really important things to say, and that it's important that, we talked earlier about like kids and your kids. And I think you have to bridge that knowledge somehow, like from people in that generation and growing up with that perspective. I think people that are our age, it's kind of like on us to bridge what they have down to the younger generations. And so to me, they're pretty important so that we can take that information and parse it down.
100%. Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, I think they're such great examples of how to, like Alvin Toffler's book, Future Shock, from, oh boy, I think that's 40, 50 years old at least as well. But that's his thing was the people of the future. Is the people of the future, the people to be successful in the future are the people that will be able to learn, unlearn, and then relearn. And those guys are great examples of that. Being able to say, hey, what were my beliefs before? And like, okay, being able to change them, being open-minded enough. And those guys are great examples of coming from a completely different world and then seeing this and be like, oh, like Larry, being a gold guy and then being able to shift perspective and be like, oh, shoot, that's a mark of a very intelligent person. Nolan Bowerley is one of my favorite guys in the Bitcoin sphere. He's got a show he does on YouTube every morning at 8 a.m. And he's grown his channel pretty quick in just a few months. It was on Robert Breedlove the other day. And still a small channel though, but like known inside the community, like just like he's been in for 10 years because like insiders know him, but no one like publicly, he's not that facing yet. but he looks at everything from like the psychological perspective, the psychological engine, and it's the same thing. And he always said, which it's funny because like when it's like the Kiyosaki always says like you're a smart person if I agree with what you're saying, right? It's like if it meets my bias, and it's like yeah, that makes sense. And I've always thought that too, of like, man, people that are intelligent, at least my definition of like genius or intelligence was people that could hold two opposing opinions in their head at the same time. In kind of the Lincoln Douglas style debates where you could debate from your opponent's perspective in it, and like that was, we've just completely lost that. Where and so Nolan Bowerley was just talking about this recently, and I was like, yes, like that's it. Like I've been saying this for like so long, for years, where it's like he was like, yeah, genius is really, and he was talking about someone else, some other guy who was saying genius is being able to kind of be able to hold these two opposing opinions and be able to be okay, which is again coming full circle now to like a Larry or these guys who have been able to like, they can hold these opinions, both of them, they're not mutually exclusive, and say, hey, no, this is this and this is that. That's true intelligence, and just it's completely lost in society. So
absolutely, I couldn't agree with that more. And I think we're in the information age, and I read something somebody was talking about like in the future it's not going to be like access to information, it's how quickly you can change or like reformat what you think about information. I'm probably not getting that totally correct, but what you said is dead on. You have to be able to learn and then unlearn and question everything and hold opposing views and understand everything full circle.
Do you think, again, I don't know if there's an answer to this, or at least your thought on it, but it's, I sometimes, I've questioned myself so many times for 20 years. I mean, since I was a kid, of like my dad is very similar to me, and I'm sure it's where I got a lot of this just in the beginning. He would question everything. My mom has stories of like, yeah, like when I started dating dad and we got married, like he'd be yelling at the TV, and this was like early 80s. He'd be yelling at the TV, being like, they just contradicted themselves. Like they just said one thing. Walter Cronkite literally just said one thing, and then they went to the reporter, and then she said the exact opposite thing or whatever, right? Like, and so like that was me from a very early age. So I just got it. Like I understood that kind of questioning everything. And she's like, I have no idea how he like just did it, but he's like a very eclectic mind as well, where it was like he's an optometrist, but he's also like, he can redo the bathroom, and he's like out in the barn like fixing the tractor, and then he's like doing, and you're like, dude, how are you doing 3,000 different projects at the same time? Like what's going on? So it was just, I've got part of that in me. I'm not to that level, but like I've got part of that. My question to you though is like, where do you draw the line? Because I've questioned myself so many times, like how do I know I'm right? Like, and as a human being, I feel like, again, not enough people do that. Not saying that I'm right or perfect or whatever, but it's like, I know I do question myself of like, I try to see the other side and be able to debate the other side and say, hey, what is the other side? So like to you, like, what do you do? Or like, how do you think about that? Of like, hey, how am I right? So I try to do it routinely, of like being able to like see the other side and like fight for the other side and be like, still doesn't make sense. Like, how do you look at all that? In the terms of questioning everything, right? Like at what point do you have to stop questioning? It's like, okay, now you're questioning everything, right? Like just a question.
Yeah. Well, I like to, like, in general, and I don't always do it perfectly, but I mean, I kind of like to think that I'm like never right. And that sort of informs my questioning, like, is just never stopping questioning. But at the same time, there's a lot of things where you continually come to the same conclusion. And I think
patterns.
Seeing a pattern in something, and I will never not listen to an opposing view, an opposing opinion, like the argument from the other side. I think that only makes your case for your case stronger, right? Like if you can't defend your belief against a counter belief, then you either don't hold it that strongly, or you're not that well informed, or maybe you're not right. So I kind of never stop questioning things, which I don't recommend for mental health, but in terms of like intellectual debate, it's fantastic. And so for me, like, if I am coming to the same conclusion over and over and over, and I've spent a significant amount of time looking at the opposite side and still coming to the same conclusion, that's when I kind of get to the point where I'm like, screw it, like, screw you guys. Like, I know that I'm right. I know that what I'm saying is legit. But I'll always
the
be open
confidence
to,
grows. Yeah.
yeah. But I'm always open to like, come at me. Like, if you think I'm wrong, come at me and I'll come back. And, you know, like I will never not be willing to change my opinion, but the more informed that I get about things, sort of the more brave or aggressive that I'll become.
Harder to knock off the stance or whatever. Yeah. That's a brilliant answer. And that fits my narrative bias for it as well, I think. Like, I agree totally. All right, cool. Last couple things in wrapping up here. I know we're getting a little bit long. We can roll this stuff into expand on more of these things as time goes on.
Sure.
What do you think is the most important? So, you know, we talked about Bitcoin, kind of the theme a little bit throughout all this, right? But in general, you having some computer science background, stuff like that, what do you think is the most important thing for people to learn about Bitcoin? Is it some of the kid stuff we talked about of just learning what money is, and hard money with Bitcoin, or is it maybe something more technical from that computer science perspective? Like, how do you kind of see all that and you, like, your ahas almost with Bitcoin, but also like what you think the most important aspect for people to kind of grasp and understand is?
Yeah. It's a hard question to answer generally, because for me, like, when I'm talking to people about Bitcoin, like, the first thing that I want to know is, where do they come from? Because different things are important to different people, right? So like, if you're a professional athlete, or if you're a carpenter, or you're a money manager, like, how you see the world, how you see money, you know, it's complex. So when I'm talking to people and I'm trying to orange pill them or talk about Bitcoin, I come at it from many, many, many angles, and I'm doing that kind of in response to where they're coming from. But I think at like the highest level, I think it's most important, first and foremost, for people to understand not necessarily like the broader psychological concept of what is money. I love that. Like, Breedlove, I love him. I think it's an amazing conversation. But understanding what money is now, like the word fiat, I think most people don't even know what the word fiat means. They don't realize that their money is really only backed by government power. They don't know that we were on a gold standard, let alone that we are now off of a gold standard. So I think fiat, understanding fiat is like, first and foremost, you have to understand that your money is fiat money. And what that means that it's controlled by the government. And that colors a lot of the bigger things. Because once you realize, all right, it's being controlled by the government, there's a lot of implications that get brought up in there. And once that's there, the other piece of it for me that's really important is actually the halving. And this is, I'm sure, you know, because I'm a tech person, or I was. But to me, the halving really explains the volatility, which is the thing that people are most concerned about. So you're on this 4-year cycle, the volatility is sort of built in. If you zoom out, it's way less volatile, right? Like, yeah, maybe year to year it's super volatile, but the further that you zoom out on those price charts, and then you add in the epochs of the halving, I think it's a relatively basic concept that people can understand, even if they don't understand like what's a block reward, like what they might not understand what the halving is. But if they understand that there's something significant and technical that happens every 4 years, and that this price fluctuation is kind of built in, not kind of, it is categorically, mathematically built in, then that, to me, often, like in these conversations that you're having with people who are outside the ecosystem completely, I find that opens them up to understanding Bitcoin on a much deeper level. Once they understand that the volatility is built in, and that it's really not that volatile, it's kind of mathematically by design, then they're really open to like, okay, maybe there's more here. So that's generally where I start. I don't think that the halving gets enough attention. Well,
yeah, well said. I think you summed that up very, very well. Cool. So we've talked about this a little bit, earlier towards the beginning a little bit, but the biggest experience or, learning growth moment that's changed you, whether it's, again, in work and just kind of what you saw overseas, it could be that, or maybe it's something growing up in, school or something like that. What was the big inflection point? I talked about some of mine, which was like the 08, 09 Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street. That was probably one of my bigger inflection points. What was something that, kind of stood out for you?
Yeah. Well, definitely there were a number of things that happened, when I was living in DC and working in tech that sort of colored my opinion and experience on like government and freedom and all the things that we talked about, which is a whole like bigger separate conversation. And then I would have to say it really is, leaving the country, traveling as much as I did and spending time in completely different worlds. So my experiences, being in the Middle East, being in China, all throughout Asia, and just living abroad, I think. And then also not just that, but I think I got lucky in a sense with the timing of all of it, because I came back. I generally say I came back at the beginning of 2018. It was like December 2017, the very end of 2017. So if you overlay that on what was happening like in politics in America, I was not here. I feel like they were running this major psyop, and I sort of opted out unintentionally because that's the time period where I was living abroad. And I came back, and I came back into a different world, and I had culture shock and whiplash, and it was insane. There is one specific moment right after I got back. I was at a friend's house, and they had some people over. We were just drinking. It was like a happy hour. And I walked past the TV, and they had CNN on, and there was this breaking news banner. Like, to me, it was like 9/11 style breaking news. And nobody was paying any attention. Nobody was looking at the TV. Nobody was talking about what was on the news. And this was right after I got back from being abroad for many years. And like my heart literally fell to the floor. I was like, what is happening? And I'm like grabbing people. I'm like, what's going on in the news? Everybody's looking at me like I'm a crazy person. And I'm like, I realized like instant, like nobody cared. Like, and then I'm seeing, I have no idea what they were talking about. And it took a long time to acclimate to that everything now was breaking news, and that everything was like a heart-stopping moment. And analyzing that was probably the most influential thing, because that to me was like this huge red flag that there was something happening. And it took a while to figure out what was happening. And then we have 2020 and all of that. But I think I just, in a way, got lucky being gone for that time frame and then coming. So yes, it's being abroad and having all of those experiences. But I think, I've met obviously a lot of people who have lived abroad and they've had unique experiences. To me, the time during which that happened is also a big factor, because so much happened, like when Trump got elected in 2016, like I was in China, like and Dubai, and they loved Trump. They were all like, oh yeah, you have a big businessman fighting for you. Like,
never would have guessed here. Never would have known that here.
Yeah, no. Oh, and they don't want to hear it, and they don't believe me. And I think regardless of what your personal opinions are, personal, political, whatever, like that's an important conversation to have. Like just the way that it was.
Yeah, Trump aside, like the fact that you're being psyoped that hard that people don't even know that here. Yeah, exactly.
Like I don't care if you don't like him. You know what I mean? And that's obviously that's a whole conversation.
Right.
But I realized, and I wanted to have that conversation with people. I was like, wait, but I'm having dinner in Shanghai, and like let's have this like 360-degree conversation about it. And if you don't want to change your mind, like I'm not even trying to change your mind. I'm just trying to inform you and talk about all.
I'm trying to see why you don't care that you're being psyoped this hard.
Yeah, exactly. So I think being abroad, but specifically during the time which I was gone, was really, really, I mean, that, it changed my whole life. So
That's so cool. Well, yeah, that's definitely stuff we'll have to wrap on more
Yeah.
too in the future. Some of that, and getting abroad. Like next time, we'll have to, after Miami, and maybe in a month or so, and talk more about, just like you being abroad and just kind of what you saw, and diving a little bit deeper into that. Because I know, again, it's hard to talk about in a way, just because, again, we have to like self-censor, because I want this stuff to live on so people can see what's going on, but you also do have to tread the line that you aren't being censored or shadow banned. And that's unfortunately the world we live in. And we're starting to put this on different areas and different things, whether it's, be the Nostr or Zion or Ghost, Bitcoin platforms, but also Rumble, things like that. So it'll be out there, but we'll tread around those issues, but talk more about them in the future. So
that'd be great.
Yeah, because it's just fascinating, and your perspective again is just so unique compared to the average person, quite honestly, whether a Bitcoiner or not. I mean, just most people in America have never even been outside of America. So
right.
In wrapping, what are you working on? I mean, any other things you want to hit quick? What project are you working on currently, or what's got you going? What's got you fired up right now?
Yeah. So I'm working really slowly on a podcast. During the bull run, I had all these people, everybody I knew was coming to me, they wanted Bitcoin, they wanted to understand it. And during that time, I was getting like the craziest questions from people that are really smart, and so that was really fascinating to me. And like what you said when we started, you were like, oh, I try not to talk too much before I start recording, because then I'm like, I should have been recording.
Yeah.
And that's basically the conclusion that I came to. Like, I have this really smart guy who works in traditional finance, and his first question was, do I get a physical coin? Like, does somebody send me something? And I was laughing, it was hysterical to me that was his first question. But then you kind of start to look at it and realize, well, until 2013, I think it was, they issued physical stock certificates. Like, it's not that crazy of a question.
Yeah, it's wild. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm trying to do this podcast where I bring on like exclusively people that are not in Bitcoin at all, and have those conversations and just record them. I think they're different than, there's a lot of content, in Bitcoin. And when you're ready to study Bitcoin, there's a lot of resources for that. But I think for people that have absolutely no idea, just no clue whatsoever what's happening or what even Bitcoin is, there's not enough education around that for people that aren't technical and people that don't feel like they have enough of a base even to start like Googling questions, because they just don't, they don't get it. So I'm working on that. I had a list of people that were, interested and willing, but as you know, it's hard to get them nailed down. And as the price of Bitcoin has dropped and we've been sideways for so long, people are less and less interested. So I'm working on that. I was hoping to start releasing some episodes, but I want to get a few more recorded before I start on like a release schedule. So that's what I'm working on right now. And then I still do some marketing consulting, and I've started talking to some people in the Bitcoin ecosystem. It's a challenge because, how do you market in this like anti-fiat world? And so I'm
the conundrum.
Yeah.
It is.
And just learning, I'm super excited to be involved in all of these conversations now. And I feel like I need to there's this next level of information that I need to dig into and learn, so that I sound like I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's funny because I think the biggest thing, and we've talked about it once or twice here today, is just understanding, what is money at the end of the day. And my simple explanation, I love, like you said, I love Breed Love's podcast and really like diving into it, history of stuff, and I love it. My simple definition of money is it's information, right? I mean, it's information. It's also a psychological engine, but it's really a container. Like money itself is just a container for your economic time and energy. I mean, it's really all money is. Like, it's not evil. It's not good or bad. It's just a tool. It's all it is. Sure. It's just a container to store your time and energy. And it's, in the space, I'm always saying to people, like, you have finite time. You need to find a finite container for that time and energy, because we trade it for these infinite liabilities that we trade our finite time for. Like, that's the dumbest trade. Like, no investor, like Warren Buffett, would look at you and be like, that's the dumbest trade for an
Right.
investor to ever make. Like, why would you
Mhm.
trade something finite for something infinite? And that's what people do every day for their fiat currency, for dollars, for pesos, for yen. And so understanding that is huge. And I think that's, coming back to what you were saying, like, I think it's so brilliant that you're doing that and trying to get people that maybe just aren't in the space at all, and just like newbies, pre-coiners, no coiners,
Yeah.
and having them do that, because again, this space is there's still not enough content in general, but there's a fair amount of people doing the macro stuff, like we said, and they're doing this, they're doing that. So it's finding different avenues to orange pill people, because I think what is money, what is fiat, those are the most important things for people to learn. So at anyone's level, if you get into Bitcoin just a little bit, starting to produce content, once you understand those basic concepts, I always tell everyone, like, we need to overwhelm the system, like
Yeah.
that's, and anytime I'm in the spaces, I'm always like shilling, like, hey, like, everyone who thinks they even want to like do a podcast or a YouTube channel or do it, because we need this to happen sooner than later, so there's less collateral, the least amount of collateral damage as possible. And because we're in a real fight, whether it's a culture wars, all these wars going on, psyop war, information war, this information fight. I tweeted out the other day, like, how many times do you have to be punched in the face with, to realize you're in an information war? Like, how many times? So anyway, where can people find you? Where's the best place for people to find you and connect with you?
On Twitter.
There we go.
So I am on Twitter exclusively now. I deleted my Facebook a number of years ago. So you can find me on Twitter, and I'll keep tweeting and working on the podcast. I appreciate that, what you say about we need more content and the time is now, because
so
I
badly.
completely agree. It's sort of now or never. And so the more that we can get out there, the better.
Yeah, and it's perfect timing too. I think anyone in the space, I mean, obviously everyone says, you build in the bear, right? And it's, we probably have a year to two really before the price really truly runs up. So like getting ready, anyone who's building right now, doing stuff, you still have 6 months, or at least 6 to 12 months of really getting your feet under you, getting going, and to lead into that bull market. Ironically, goes right along with the presidential election, which again, another thing where I feel like that's going to be like the topic of the election, quite honestly, at this point, the way things are trending. Boy, oh boy, wild. So what a great time. It's going to be wild. It's going to be absolutely wild. Thank you so much, Michelle, for doing this. I look forward. Yeah, I look forward to doing this. I could do this for hours and hours and hours. I, of course, have to get going here in a little bit. So I'm like, what went longer? So I appreciate you staying longer. That I could just keep going, talking about all this. So we'll, a few weeks, I'll see you in Miami, and then we'll, we can talk about it then too, but we'll have to maybe even record some then too. But I just want to go deeper into some of this stuff, like these things that
I'd love to.
Yeah, but most people haven't seen. I think that's what's really interesting, pulling that out of people and getting kind of a different perspective from what you see on Bitcoin Twitter all the time, which is just a lot of armchair quarterbacking and things like that. So appreciate you.
It was really, really great to talk to you. And I look forward to seeing you in Miami.
Yeah, me too. Same here. Thanks, Michelle. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow, unbelievable story Michelle has, and an unbelievable person to follow. I really hope that you enjoyed this session, the search for playable characters in a sea of non-playable characters. Please share this out. Anytime you see anything, my plea to you is, anytime you see something that strikes a chord, any type of truth you see, no matter where it be, please share it out, because the algorithm hates truth. And the only way we can minimize collateral damage in this world and make the transition from the sinking fiat Titanic onto the Bitcoin life raft is to share truth anywhere you see it. Question everything with boldness, even the existence of God himself. This is not financial advice, it's freedom advice at the end of the day. So please share it out. Please share this journey of trying to educate people as our founding fathers once quipped. I'm paraphrasing, but once your formal education and your real education begins, and I know Jim Rohn talks about that, Bob Proctor, and our founding fathers talked about that here in America, but it pertains to everyone across the world. We have been brainwashed by a system that is there to control us, going back to 1902 and the General Board of Education, really Karl Marx in 1848, but then the General Board of Education in 1902, Rockefeller himself saying, I want doers, not thinkers. And we must combat that with true education, with being the people we are called to be, and finding the calling from within. The thing that you're running from, that's the thing that you're called to do. What can we do to further humanity and bring freedom, liberty, and justice, and fair a playing field, equal playing field, not equal outcomes, but equal playing field to all people, and what the founding documents in America promised to set out to do, and what the white paper is really the founding documents of America 2.0, and what that gives the people all around the world now, not just regionally in America, but all around the world, the ability to do. So I invite you on this journey. Please share this out, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. And give Michelle a follow. She is well worth it. Her insights are invaluable, and she's an incredibly important part of this journey to freedom and a true playable character. We'll see you in the next one.